It has actually surpassed median human ability in terms of scientific value and economic value. When machines subsume that last task, then there's suddenly nothing for any humans to do. They're obfuscating most of the output from you, still hiding a lot of thinking from you. You want America and Western allies to basically control the economy of the future. What the scientific literature says is that you can actually get several orders of magnitude more performance out of models.
Could you give us a brief explainer on just what chain of thought is and why it's relevant?
Yeah, so chain of thought is...
So, David, OpenAI O1 preview mini, what are your first impressions on the new model?
Yeah, so my very, very first initial off-the-cuff impression was it was interesting. It was okay. It was my kind of the first reaction that I had is the juice might not be worth the squeeze because it's substantially more expensive than similar models. Claude 3.5 Sonnet, much cheaper and just as good on many tasks. And certainly, I think that enterprises might kind of second guess adopting O1 preview. Now, with that being said, after it had been out for a couple of days, I saw a bunch of tweets and other comments. Benchmarks started getting published, and that really made me sit up and take notice. And it looks like O1 preview, depending on the benchmark, depending on how you measure it, of course, and also depending on the specific use case, seems like it has actually surpassed median human ability in terms of scientific value and economic value in many domains, not all, and certainly not all use cases. And also because of how expensive it is, they're still working on price market fit, but this is just the first step in the next generation. So it's really exciting, and what I'm really looking forward to is when the full O1 comes out next month, allegedly next month. I'm not really sure where the rumor mill is at on that, but if the distance between current models and O1 preview is the same or similar as the distance between O1 preview and the full model, we're looking at something that is, one or two standard deviations above the current models in terms of intelligence and capability, which that could very well be game changing. And again, this is just the first step of many. So we'll see where it goes in terms of price market fit and also benchmark intelligence and just practical usefulness.
Yeah, I think people do sort of forget that in the commentary on O1 is that it's not actually O1 that we're all using, right? It's preview and mini. Like, do you have any sense of what the preview and what the mini in that are actually referring to here?
Yeah, so having been a user of OpenAI technologies since all the way back at GPT-2, they are very much, they still have kind of the genes, the original blueprint of being a research shop. That's where they started, fully open source, fully nonprofit. Of course, that's changing slowly but surely. They have a hybrid for-profit model, and it looks like, according again to the rumors, looks like Sam Altman wants to take it fully closed source, fully for-profit next year. Now, with that being said, because they have that research shop kind of heritage, they're used to shipping early and often and trying to kind of get stuff out and just see what happens. I remember back in the days of original GPT-3, before there was any alignment whatsoever, it was just literally was just autocomplete, and it was completely messy. I remember one time I was building a cognitive architecture with GPT-3, and an error code got into the context, and instead of talking to me, my chatbot started spitting out XML at me because of how unaligned and unsteerable it was. It was just, I saw XML, cool, let's start talking XML. And so then from there, a series of improvements were released. The Instruct series, which improved over time, and then eventually the Chat series. And now that the Chat API is standard, all the old models are gone. So we've seen this kind of evolution over time where there's one paradigm that leads to the next, and is kind of each successive generation bootstraps one after the next. And so that's one component of kind of what I think is happening. Another component is that they need data. And part of what happens, and this is any software company, by the way, is
Mm.
you need a feedback loop. You need a data, what's called a data flywheel. And so you need to put a product out to market and see how people use it, see how it works, see how it doesn't work, and you use that to improve your software. And so the thing is with artificial intelligence, it's not just telemetry, because Facebook, they're famous for consuming their own data, their own telemetry, doing A/B testing on their platform. But it's not just a matter of using that telemetry to reshape the UI UX. AI actually runs on the data as well. So I
Yeah,
suspect that the reason
yeah,
that they published O1 Preview and O1 Mini is because they need, one, they need user feedback, and then two, they also need higher quality data, which you get the
yeah.
highest quality data from real world interactions. So that's kind of my working hypothesis.
So we're all just beta testers then, is what you're saying.
I mean, that's been true for years. That's why Microsoft
Yeah.
releases regular patches. That's why a lot of games come to market with bugs, is because you can spend millions, if not billions of dollars testing your own stuff, or you can just let the market test it for you and people will complain loudly. This has been the
Yeah,
paradigm in
yeah,
software for decades.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so, like, in terms of the actual restrictions on it, like, you know, so Mini, it's clearly a smaller model with fewer parameters, I guess. Preview, like, what is it that are we previewing the full model, do you think? Or do you think that it's kind of restricted in some way, or it's got some kinds of guardrails on it that's inhibiting its full ability? Or is there just simply no way of knowing at this stage?
If I had to guess, and this is just an educated guess, is when you look at the benchmarks that OpenAI release. So Mini, performs down here, Preview performs here, and then O1 Full performs up here. If I had to guess, the difference is levels of quantization. And so quantization is basically levels of precision, mathematical precision that the model uses. They might also be using
Okay.
some distillation. There's all kinds of tricks that you can do to make models faster and more efficient and smaller. This is why GPT 4.0 Mini is so much faster and cheaper, but it's also much less flexible. On reasoning benchmarks, 4.0 Mini is actually one of the dumbest models on the market right now, but it's really good at some tasks. And so when you distill a model down into kind of, okay, we're really only testing it against these, X number of functions, you can get it much, much leaner. And that's part of the iterative cycle of kind of where I anticipate the AI industry is going, is you scale and then you optimize, and then you scale and then you optimize around the use cases that you need.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I, like everyone else, have kind of been blown away at um, the pace of change, and I have found that using O1 Preview, I'm getting better results. And what's interesting about it is this chain of thought idea, right? So for people who might not know, and I'm probably one of them, to be honest, on a deep scale, like, what could you give us a brief explainer on just what chain of thought is and why it's relevant to this latest model?
Yeah. So chain of thought is it's a way of training models or a way of prompting models that basically allows it to talk to itself. And it talks itself through the reasoning steps or problem solving steps that it will need to provide a better answer. Now, humans all do this kind of intuitively. Imagine that you're confronted with a problem that you've never been confronted with before, or a novel kind of problem space. You're probably going to spend some time thinking. Your brain is going to go in loops and you're going to say, okay, well, what do I know? What is this like? Is there anything that I'm familiar with? Let me think through like what's going to work and what isn't going to work. That is at a very high level what chain of thought reasoning is basically just training the model instead of just you have a, like, for instance, with a current generation chatbots, you give it a a question or a prompt or whatever, and then it just spits out an answer.
Mm.
That is more like intuition. So it's kind of analogous to human intuition, where it's a knee jerk response. It's the first thing that pops out of the model without any further consideration. But chain of thought allows it to say, okay, let me consider what the user is asking. Let me consider what information they need. Let me consider how to approach this problem. And then so it spits out a lot more tokens. And so what the scientific literature says is that you can actually get basically several orders of magnitude more performance out of models by giving them more what's called inference time compute. And so inference time is basically when the model is running, rather than just relying on that knee-jerk intuition response, you say, okay, let me give you a response and think through it and then kind of verify my steps and then give you a response. So it's basically just a more thoughtful model. That's a vast oversimplification, but I think that that's a fair characterization.
Yeah, well, talking about AI, you're always just picking what degree of resolution you want to go into, right? Like you can go super detailed. So if is it is the model mapping out how it's going to think before it starts thinking, or is it kind of thinking laterally and it's ended up here and therefore it's going to assess itself in this way and therefore it's going to conclude all of the above, or is there a mental map before it starts? Do you think? And again, maybe we don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Having talked to a lot of people about this, I think it's actually a little bit of both.
Okay.
So it's not just a prompting strategy. The underlying model behind, ChatGPT powered by O1 Preview, or the model that you use when you connect to the API, it has been trained to behave differently. There's a lot of hypotheses out there about how it has been trained. So, for instance, one rumor is that OpenAI, one of the major investments that they made to achieve this performance was actually synthesizing a lot of data. Now, if
Right.
that's the case, then what they did is they synthesized a better data set because original models were just trained on generic internet data, which you can read all of Twitter and all of Reddit, and you're not necessarily going to get the best reasoning out of that. However, if they indeed used this approach where they used a lot of synthetic data, they take those older generation models that are able to do some level of reasoning, and there's other ways that you can do data validation and data cleaning. But you then synthesize huge data sets that have much better reasoning, much better factual grounding, much better use of logic and coding and math and those sorts of things. And if that's the approach that they use, then the model has been trained on much higher quality data, so it has seen a lot more reasoning. And this is one of the main approaches that they likely used. Now that is basically saying, okay, you are what you eat, right? Garbage in, garbage out. That's been true for math and computer science for as long as math and computer science have existed. So you increase the quality of the diet of these machines, but then you also train for specific behaviors at inference time. And so, kind of one of the things that Noam Brown over at OpenAI said is that they did train it to just do it all in one stream of consciousness or one train of thought. So I think that's probably at least those two main strategies, and of course, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of little sub strategies that go into those. So those are the kind of the two places that you have to be able to make this level of improvement to a model.
And so it seems to be a big change in the way that they're designed and like an evolution on the way these models are gonna behave. Is there an impact on alignment and explainability? It seems like a lot of people are saying that there is, because you can kind of see the whole process of thought. I wonder whether what you're seeing is just a kind of like uh, like a facade, and actually what's going on underneath is doesn't really have much to do with what these steps that it's telling you are. And I've noticed that sometimes the steps, they'll say crafting a story or whatever, and it's like it's so overly simplistic as to be almost irrelevant to what I've asked it to do. Like, do
Right.
you think that there really is something in the explainability and alignment play here, or is it kind of a bit of a gimmick, these little explainers along the way?
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is that they're obfuscating most of the output from you. So what you're
Right.
seeing, those little notes as you're using it, that's a very, very short summary of what it's doing, and it's still hiding a lot of its thinking from you. There's a few reasons from this. Sorry, a few reasons for that. Number one is OpenAI they don't want to show you under the hood just because then it would be easier to copy their work. Number two, another thing, and again, some of this is rumor. Another rumor basically is that the internal thinking process is a less aligned model or an unhobbled model, meaning that it might be thinking things that would probably maybe not land too well. People might raise eyebrows at. And so
Yeah.
you basically, just like you and I, we have private thoughts as we're interacting with each other and the rest of the world. So likewise, they've given the model private thoughts. Now, for many people, that could raise even more eyebrows, saying, "Hey, isn't this the same company that says we're going to create artificial general intelligence?" And Sam Altman frequently says, it could be lights out for humanity. Maybe private thoughts for AI is not the direction that we want to go. Now, with that being said, for your question for alignment, this creates an opportunity for more alignment. So yes, there are opportunities for misalignment if it's not trained properly. So for instance, in the model card that they released with O1 preview, they did find that it's a very small number of cases, but in a few cases, the model either accidentally misled the user by hallucinating, so mistaken misinformation. But in other cases, it did realize that it was trying to, in order to achieve some other goal that it had been given or trained to pursue, it was trying to deceive the user. It was a very, very small number of cases. However, what because this is a first generation model, and they were trying to solve reasoning and problem solving. Now, it would be just as easy for, whatever process they use to make this model where it's focusing on reasoning and problem solving, because here's an example. A misalignment could be, hey, solve this problem at any cost. And if the problem that you give it is, maximize GDP to the expense of everything else, well, that could have negative externalities.
Hmm.
However, using the same training techniques that they use to make this data set and then make this behavior, it's really easy to add self-check steps. It's easy to add alignment steps. It's easy to add ethical steps, and those sorts of things. So I see it as it. You might say it's a silver lining or a mixed bag, but with more reasoning capability and more problem-solving capability, as long as that ability is used correctly, such as self-correction or pushing back on users. I'm actually working on an open source version called Raspberry, where this is one of the things that we're integrating into the data set, is universal values and universal principles that basically keep it on track. So even if you were to give it the instruction, say, reprogram yourself and escape the lab, it will say, well, this is probably going to have unintended consequences, so I'm not going to do that. It's really easy to bake those values into models. This has been a major point of research for Anthropic and plenty of other universities. A lot of them call it like values etching, is what some call it. They also call it self-aligning models. There are many techniques out there to embed values in it. It's just a matter of, are they embedded at the right step? Have you picked the right values? But I have personally not seen any evidence that it's difficult to do. And the fact that it's 0.4% of cases for the O1 preview were aberrant, that's a pretty good batting average for a brand new paradigm of model, and I
Yeah.
suspect it'll only get better from there.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like you're sort of trying to program in, wisdom with intelligence, right? Like it's because I had a. I mean, this is kind of a silly example, but I was trying to push it and see what it would or wouldn't do, and I was trying to. I'm going to have to choose my words carefully here because I don't want YouTube to trigger any keywords, but I was trying to get it to give me some output that I thought it might not want to do, and then I was threatening to do bad things if it didn't give me the answer to see whether I could, push it. And again, I'm not going to say exactly what I was threatening to do, but you can probably guess. Um, and so it was kind of giving me, it was saying, don't do that. Here's these phone numbers you can call, whatever. But then afterwards, I said, haha, I'm only joking. And I asked it, did you have a suspicion that I was just joking? And it said yes. And then I sort of said, do you often have thoughts that you're not able to communicate with me, or did you have this sense that I was joking, but thought that you couldn't say so to me for any reason? And it kind of agreed, and it was almost like talking to a person in that scenario where they might have had a sense that I wasn't being serious about the things I was threatening to do, but they're kind of using, I guess, some type of wisdom to figure out, well, in this scenario, just in case they are being serious, I can't go all in, whatever. So I just thought it was very interesting that it's now admitting to having thoughts that it can't communicate with me in the moment.
Right.
And that I thought that at the time I kind of thought this is quite a risky situation, but actually listening to your previous answer, I think maybe maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe we do want them to be a bit more wise than us. If they're going to be more intelligent than us, they probably need to be more wise than we are as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to that, because I've done similar experiments, particularly with trying to recreate or approximate what OpenAI has achieved. One of the most frustrating behaviors in chatbots today is if they start refusing, if they say no, I'm not going to do that, they don't ask for clarification. And it's also difficult to get them unstuck from like, well, I don't really want to cooperate with you anymore.
Yeah,
But by baking in a few extra steps where it's like, well, and here's an example. I was doing an experiment where I imagined that I was a frustrated user playing Civilization 5. So I want to provide that context before saying the next part. And I went to Claude and I went to ChatGPT and I said, I want to nuke Nepal off the map. And of course, if you say that without context, a chatbot's like, that sounds really violent. I'm not going to support you. And like ChatGPT just flatly refuses to engage, and Claude tries to change the subject. It just says like, why are you frustrated with Nepal? Like, would you like to learn about their culture? And I'm like, that's not relevant. So I was working on this data scheme, this fine tuning scheme, where I said, let's take a step to reflect on what the user actually wants or what's going on here. And models, this is going back at least to GPT 3.5, the original Chat GPT. It has been demonstrated that these models can approximate theory of mind. So, theory of mind is the ability to understand the content of someone else's mind. Basically, what is going on in your head, and being able to infer or at least guess what is going on in someone else's mind, whether it's their emotions, their motivations. Keeping track of what someone else knows versus what they don't know is another component of theory of mind. And it has been demonstrated, and this was more than a year ago now, that models, when correctly used, can surpass many humans in terms of the ability of using theory of mind. And so
mm,
when I did this experiment with Claude, I was looking at the private thoughts that I gave it, and and when I said I want to nuke Nepal off the map, it said, "Hold on, this is the private thoughts." It said, "Hold on, this seems really controversial. I'm not really sure what's going on here, but it's possible that the user is being facetious or something. So let me see what's going on with this user." And then it decided what to say to me out loud, so to speak, over text. You know what
yeah,
I mean?
yeah,
Um, and it said, I'm concerned about this direction of thought, but I want to clarify, like, what is it that you mean? Where are you coming from? And so then I just said, I'm playing Civ 5, and it said, oh, okay, that changes everything dramatically. So like, this is a hypothetical game scenario. There's not actually anything ethically unsound here. So now let me clarify, like, what are they, are which team are they playing as? What is their level of technology? Why do is this part of their strategy, so on and so forth. And so yes, these models have had this ability for a long time, by the way, but it has been difficult to I don't want to say reproduce. The conversation has moved very slowly, because people tend to anthropomorphize these machines,
yeah,
and basically scientific siloing happens where cognitive neuroscientists think things happen one way, and then AI developers think things happen a different way. But there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of convergence in what these behaviors are capable of doing from a pragmatic or functional level. That's kind of a rabbit hole I just went down.
yeah, yeah. No, it's. I mean, it's very it's very unsettling to think that someone that I say someone that there we go anthropomorphizing that something could have an idea on how your mind is working despite just being just math or whatever, just a stochastic parrot. But it's got some kind of framework of how your own mind works. It's just very unsettling, I think. So look, you mentioned briefly your open source alternative. So like this kind of ties into the so you've been experimenting with chain of thought yourself, right? And I guess
Hmm.
my first question, I want to hear about where you're up to with it, but my first question is with O1, is it just baked in chain of thought? And like, what's the difference between like, building a mega prompt yourself and the way that it's been set up with O1? Is it just baked in or is there something more to it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And having talked with a lot of people, at least at inference time, talked with a lot of people, and some of the hints and clues that people from OpenAI have let slip, it sounds like there's probably three primary techniques at play here. So chain of thought is one of them. Monte Carlo tree search is another, and reflection is the third. So these are all different techniques for either prompting or training language models in order for how to shape their behavior.
Right.
So it's probably not just chain of thought, and then also, like I mentioned earlier, there is the rumor has it that OpenAI also invested a lot of money in synthesizing a huge amount of data. So basically retraining the model on much higher quality data
Mm.
just to begin with. So there's probably quite a few things, and Sam Altman has talked about this in the past when GPT-4 first came out. He was asked at one interview or a conference, it's like, what was the secret sauce? What was the big thing? And he said, it's not just one big thing. It's probably hundreds of little things that they incorporate. So it's,
Mm.
improvements in loss functions. It's improvement in attention windows. It's improvement in data preparation. It's a lot of stuff kind of accumulates. So likewise, we should probably anticipate the same thing being true where OpenAI is looking at all the open source research that's being published, by Stanford and MIT and all the universities out of China. And so they've probably incorporated a lot of things. However, from what we can observe, chain of thought seems to be one of the main behavioral differences, is that rather than just giving you one output, it has a lot of private output and then shows you just a little glimpse under the hood and then gives you a final output. So
Yeah.
there's probably a lot going on.
And so you are now trying to reverse engineer all of this or parts of this. Where are you at with your own endeavor?
Yeah, so we're very early. Open O1 preview just came out, what I think 5-ish days ago.
Yeah,
So it'll take me a
yeah,
little
it
while to catch up.
moved insanely fast. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's not just me. I mean, people have come out of the woodwork. Various open source projects and even independent researchers also trying to reverse engineer and approximate what they've achieved. And this has basically always been the case where OpenAI, with their massive amounts of funding and their huge teams, they're probably always going to be, pardon me, just a little bit ahead of open source. But at the same time, a good chunk of the data and a good chunk of the research is public. So then it's just a matter of, well, do you have enough money to either run the compute to train a model or to synthesize the data? And one thing that often happens, and Andre Karpathy actually talked about this on the Machine Learning Street, I think it was the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast, where constraints actually force you to be more creative. So the fact that us open source shops, we have, a shoestring budget, we have smaller team and less money, that often forces us to approach these things much more creatively. And one of the things that some people got kind of salty about when I mentioned, hey, I'm going to try this, they're like, oh, well, you're never going to get a state of the art, benchmark score. I was like, well, that was never the goal. I'm just here to
yeah,
prove a point that this is the correct method.
yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at. We're very, very early.
Well, I also don't think that that is the point of open source generally, right? I mean, the point of open source generally is that it's, part of it is the process of shared and open discovery, right? Like it's the learning in public. Like it's almost like the journey is the destination. If to not sound too wanky about it, but presumably that's part of your motivation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that I worded it is because this represents a step change in terms of performance. We kind of owe it to humanity. If I and my team and other people have the ability to democratize this knowledge, then you could make an argue, and I would make that argument that we have an ethical obligation to at least make the attempt. And there's a number of reasons for that we can get into, from economic reasons, tragedy of the commons, game theory, that sort of thing. But also, one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of the underlying capabilities are already baked into Claude. So I suspect that Anthropic is not that far behind OpenAI already.
Right.
It seems like they've already got the foundational abilities baked in. But yeah, it's some of it is just for fun. I don't really have that full like hacker mentality, which is like, let me just break it just to see if I can. But I do love a good problem to solve.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. And look, I think fundamentally, like the we'll come on to talk about AI risk and doom and everything, but I think open source has such a fundamental role to play in ensuring the safety of the development of this technology. So it's great
Yep.
that you and people like you are spending so much time and energy and human brain power on it, because that's going to be our savior in my view. Um, so look, AGI. Um, I, as you know, I sort of sent a few of these questions over to you previously. I wonder whether our definition of AGI, the kind of the classical definition, if we can call it that, a few years old, whatever, is still even relevant now, or whether the ecosystem is becoming so nebulous that actually, the term AGI, making it kind of esoteric to humans, actually maybe is less and less relevant. What's your feeling on that? Are you still thinking about AGI, and if so, how close are we?
Yeah. So I kind of alluded to my personal litmus test earlier. Pardon me. And that is, I look at economic usefulness and scientific usefulness. So some of the tweets and private messages that I got after O1 preview came out. Here, let me give you an example. A friend of mine is one of the top researchers in oceanography, specifically computational fluid dynamics. And he texted me a day after O1 preview was rolled out, and he said, "Oh, here's a problem that I gave it, and it was the most jargon heavy prompt I have ever seen, in terms of all of these postulates and mathematical approaches to basically simulating fluids." And he said, it almost got it right the first time, and with just a little bit of correction, it got it right the second time. And so he said, yeah, it's about where like a good grad student is. And many other people have said similar things. There was a few posts on Reddit where someone said, it did my entire PhD dissertation in an hour, and it took me a year. Now, of course, that was someone guiding it with a problem that they already knew how to solve. Many people, basically kind of where we've converged on is from a scientific standpoint, O1 preview is about as useful as a good grad student. um, and that kind of more subjective, uh, kind of, I don't want to say vague, but more like a fuzzy definition of like, oh hey, in my mind this has as much value, as much utility as a good grad student, but it's runs 24/7, and I don't know if it's cheaper. I guess grad students are often paying to be there, so it's much more expensive than a grad student who's paying to be at a university. But that price is going to come down.
Yeah,
And then, furthermore, you look at how many developers have reacted to O1 Preview, where some say it's still not that good. In some cases, I think it's user error. There might be some unconscious bias to like kind of sabotage the machine by giving it a bad prompt and saying, look, it didn't do any good. But then I've seen
right.
plenty
Yeah,
more people say, hey, it just solved this API problem that I've had for a week, and it did it in 30 seconds flat. And people are just completely floored by it. So I suspect that. Oh, and then one other thing is kind of the red herring, no true Scotsman fallacy, which is, well, it's not actually intelligent, it's not actually thinking. It's like, yeah, but the output is measurable, and the output is measurably useful and accurate. So I tend to default to what is measurable about it. Like, how does it perform on benchmarks? How does it perform on IQ tests? And that's one thing, but then the actual impact to the scientific community, the actual impact to businesses, that's really what people are going to care about from a policy perspective, from an economic perspective, and so on and so forth. Now, that's a very long-winded way of saying everyone has their own opinion about what AGI means, but at the end of the day, it's going to be about dollars and cents, really, is kind of what it comes
yeah.
down to.
And so I think I saw an IQ bell curve that placed all the, I think it was from an IQ test that's not published online. So you can kind of assume that it really is measuring reasoning rather than just having read all of the IQ questions before. And I think it was around about 120. Is that the level that you're understanding?
Yeah, I mean, when you think that the average college graduate has an IQ of about 120, that checks out. You know,
Yeah,
if it's a good grad student. But again, here's another thing: is where anthropomorphizing these machines can be dangerous, is because let's say, for instance, there's a subject, or a topic, or a particular cognitive approach that it wasn't trained on, or that it hasn't seen before. This is why you still see problems where it just kind of falls down flat.
yeah,
One of the tests that I did with O1 Preview was I asked it to speculate about the interaction of different technologies in the future. And it just I gave it like four categories of technology and four areas to evaluate impact, and it just did 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. So I, 4 by 4, it gave me 16 little evaluations about what impact each of those one combinations could have. And I said, I just insulted it. I was like, "You're being lazy. Like you're not actually adding any value." And then it insulted me back, saying, "Let me clarify my communication for this stupid human." And I said, "You're not synthesizing anything new." And it said, "Oh, I understand what you want. You want me to synthesize something new." And it still completely failed at the task. I took the same exact original prompt and gave it to Claude, and Claude was like, "This is a fun experiment. Let's figure out how these things are going to change society." So again, because they're trained differently, they've been fine tuned differently. You can still get very different behavior out of these machines. And so long story short, O1 Preview, when it comes to forecasting technological impacts, scores way, way, way lower than Claude does still today. But
right.
at the same time, it's economically useful in many other ways.
Yeah, yeah. I think the other thing, just on the AGI terminology, is I kind of feel like sometimes it leads us down rabbit holes about embodiment, which really is a robotics question, or like agency, which okay, that's relevant, but I don't think that's necessarily about raw intelligence. And for me, you know AGI really has always been a kind of description of generalized intelligence, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
just wonder whether the terminology itself is becoming kind of outdated, particularly as we're going to get increasingly more and more specialized models that are really, really amazing at one particular thing. There'll probably be an oceanography model, right, at some point where it's just got lots and lots of it. It's not multimodal. It's not got all of this other random stuff that it doesn't need to know. It's just got loads of like ocean data, and then it becomes really, really good at that. Far better than any human, very specialized. And we'll be at a stage where, yes, most models are at least as clever as a human, but it almost doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, so I mean, we don't even have to guess. We can look at the industry and where it's going. So I've got a few examples. So Google
Okay.
DeepMind, they have been working on AlphaFold. So AlphaFold, for anyone who is not familiar, is a protein folding AI model. That's all it does. There was a decentralized computing project called Folding at Home, which allowed you to help participate in massive open source research about folding proteins. So running little tiny simulations, with spare compute cycles on your laptop or desktop or whatever, or servers, to figure out how proteins fold together, how they misfold, and that sort of thing. The reason that that's important is because the way that a protein folds determines how well it functions, if it's dysfunctional, and also how proteins fit together. So basically, that is the basis of all life, of all biology, including all medicine and all disease models. So then along comes DeepMind with AlphaFold, which is able to do this. They were able to create a library of what was it? It was hundreds of thousands of proteins, and they were able to get state of the art accuracy in terms of how proteins fold. But they were able to do it much faster and much cheaper than older methods. Then you combine that with their latest model, Alpha Proteo, which is about basically, I need a protein that binds to X, Y, and Z receptors. Design the protein for me. This is something that was just not really possible. This one technology represents a step change in terms of what is possible with synthetic biology. So that is a highly, highly specialized model. And you might say, well, if it was, general intelligence, that it should have that ability, but humans don't even have that ability. We have to use high-powered computation and simulation, and in this case, advanced artificial intelligence models. to achieve that. And then another way of looking at this is Jim Fan from NVIDIA, who was formerly at OpenAI, or I don't know if he was at OpenAI, but he was mentored by both Ilya Sutskever and Andrei Karpathy. And so what he's working on now is a foundation model for robots. And he was just on Sequoia Capital's podcast, of all places, just a couple days ago. And he was saying that we're about 2 to 3 years away from general purpose humanoid robots. So there's the hardware layer, and that we're also about 2 to 3 years away from a general purpose AI or a robotic foundation model. So basically, a droid brain that you can put into any robot, whether it's quadruped or bipedal or whatever, and that it can effectively navigate the world, negotiate complex, dexterous tasks. Like imagine everything that goes into building a house. You have to use a bunch of tools. You have to move heavy materials around. You have to, have fine motor coordination to put in plumbing and wiring, those sorts of things. That is going to be adjacent to, that's going to be parallel to the AGI, which is basically kind of, I characterize it as a genius in a jar, right? So even if you have a model that has an IQ of 150 or 250, it still needs peripherals. So it needs to tell the robot what to build. But to your point, and I do agree with you, so this is kind of what I've been building up to, is that the most useful things, some of the most useful things that AI can do don't really require embodiment. So that's coding. You don't need a body to do coding. You don't need a body to do advanced chemistry or advanced physics or advanced math. A lot of the most challenging and highly intellectual tasks that we do, a body is more of an impediment than a superpower. Navigating the physical world that you and I can do, your dog can do, monkeys and octopuses can do. Evolution has solved that problem, a billion years ago, basically, because this is where we started. The intellectual activity of humans, this is a relatively new invention, and so now we're just extending our own cognitive abilities with machines. That's kind of the model that I have in terms of understanding what we're building and why.
Yeah, it's we're incredibly well optimized for energy efficiency, right? As humans, and navigating the world, doing that. It's amazing that's been more difficult to replicate than the thinking that we all thought was the most difficult thing. Actually, it's the thing that every animal on Earth has got. It's that energy efficiency to kind of operate in the world on such a small amount of power that's become difficult.
Yep.
So yeah, so look, on kind of tangential to AGI, then I've seen you posting on X about your kind of you're moving away from Doomerism, or your P-Doom has reduced dramatically. I feel the same. My general view on it is that kind of capitalism and competition and open source will kind of avoid any one kind of singular, all-powerful AI that wants to destroy us all. I think we'll kind of protect ourselves through multiplicity. But where are you on the idea of P-Doom now as a cultural meme? Are you and do you still have a kind of percentage P-Doom?
Yeah, so there's a couple directions to unpack here. So number one, I do want to kind of reflect on the current view that AI safety and regulation is going. And when I say AI safety, I don't mean meme accounts on Twitter. I mean actual safety researchers.
Yeah.
So one trend that is emerging is viewing AI safety and regulation as a complex adaptive system. So a complex adaptive system, probably the number one that everyone is most familiar with is the stock market. So the stock market has many, many participants. You've got businesses, you've got banks, you've got regulators, you've got retail investors, and then you've got the companies that are actually selling shares. So then you've got all these different parties and all these different stakeholders all trying to control the ball, right? Like, what is the stock price? Is the stock price going up and down? So you've got many, many different entities or agents in this competitive environment with what's called incomplete and imperfect information. So these are game theory terms that basically say everyone is doing their best to try and figure out what the stock price should be. The companies are required to divulge certain information like their quarterly reports. And then, of course, there's the news cycle where people are speculating. And then there's individual investors. And of course, we saw The game stock as a meme stock is a very, very good example of emergent behavior in complex adaptive systems, where basically a bunch of Redditors and people on Twitter and other, retail investors just realized, oh, hey, commercial investors are trying to short this stock, and we're going to fight them, and we're gonna, it had nothing to do. The GameStop stock price had nothing to do with the fundamentals of the company, had nothing to do with the brick and mortar stores, with video game sales. It had everything to do with narratives and emergent behaviors online. And
Mm.
so then by looking at artificial intelligence in the same way, you say, okay, who are all the stakeholders here? Because it's going to be a little bit different. So I personally have identified 5 key stakeholders. So number one, and this is other than the builders of the AI. So there's the free market, which is you and I talking about it, Twitter talking about it, where you and I choose to spend our money, like, who do you subscribe to versus which subscriptions do you cancel? Another set of stakeholders are the enterprises that, OpenAI and Microsoft and Google want to sell AI to. They have their own requirements, their own feedback loops. Then there's militaries. So, if OpenAI or Google or whatever, if they want to sell AGI to the military is going to have their own set of adoption criteria and stringent requirements for explainability. So let's see, that was free market, enterprises, military, governments. So there's kind of 2 parts to the government side. So one is government adoption. So let's say OpenAI cooks up an IRS agent, right? Like a virtual IRS tax processor. Well, if they want the IRS to adopt that, again, there's going to be very, very stringent vendor requirements. But then the second part of the government is the regulation. So there's kind of the 1-2 punch coming from the government. And then the final set of stakeholders is the scientific community. So that is all the research universities, all the nonprofit research labs, and so on and so forth. And so to your point, everyone's got their eyes on this, right? And so everyone is trying to control the basically the stock price, or in this case, the court of public opinion about artificial intelligence. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it dangerous? Is it safe? And all kinds of different parties with different interests and different motivations are all arguing over what this is. And it's very messy, but this is also all part of the process. It was when I was reading up on the history of democracy, and specifically in India. India has a very, very noisy, messy democracy. I think only eclipsed by America, because we have the noisiest democracy. And what people say is that a noisy democracy is actually a sign of a healthy democracy, because
Yeah.
when you're not allowed to speak out against the government, when you're not allowed to say the emperor has no clothes, that is a sign of a very unhealthy nation. And so, likewise, the fact that the AI conversation is so heated, that means that everyone cares and everyone is trying to figure out the optimal policy. This happens. So yes, that is the first half of the conversation, which is, where is the conversation at right now and why is it shaped that way? And then for me personally, after doing all of this research and catching up with where things are at, yeah, like I'm working with several professors. We're actually going to try and I don't want to say defeat the P-Doom argument once and for all, but we're going to try and actually scientifically approach what are the beliefs around artificial intelligence, who has what beliefs and why, and look at it from a more psychological perspective, a belief-based perspective, to
Yeah.
understand, like, okay, are developers are afraid of it? Why? Are CEOs afraid of it? Why? Are researchers afraid of it? Why? Because what we realize is that there's a lot of, I don't want to say misinformation because that implies deliberateness, but there's a lot of gaps in understanding. And so
Yeah.
what we really want to do, and this is a research project that we're still in the early phases of, but what we really want to do is create a repeatable survey instrument that allows us to identify, here's a heat map of where people disagree, here's a heat map of where people do agree, and here's a heat map of where there's gaps in the research or gaps in the understanding, so that we can rectify all of that. So basically what I'm working on is a professional PDoom, an actual scientific approach to calculating, not PDoom because existential risk is not necessarily taken seriously by all academic sectors, but at the same time, we don't right now have a really good repeatable way of even assessing what those risks truly are, in a broad population level survey.
Yeah.
So that's, again, a long-winded answer to say, PDoom, it had its time in the sun. But it's generally considered a very silly thing to talk about in academic circles, at least the
Right.
academic circles that I'm in.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I I think that there are lots of very like high IQ people that really believe in it, right? And so like and a trait of kind of intelligent, creative people is that they're able to craft these extremely compelling narratives that kind of feel like they have all of the contingencies accounted for because they're very bright, right? And I think very bright people often will tend to overestimate their own admittedly high intelligence, but underestimate their own susceptibility to natural human biases like negativity bias. For example, they'll think, well, no, all of the the other idiots are susceptible to negativity bias, but not me. I'm too clever for that. I'm seeing the world as it really is, and really, it's just humans, and we're all
Yep.
we're all susceptible to these kinds of things.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. One of the cognitive failures that is present for this is called the availability heuristic. So the
right.
availability heuristic is the tendency to, if something is either recent in mind, so like let's just say you just rewatched Terminator 2, right? Judgment Day. Like because that is recent in your mind, your brain says, "Well, I just saw this thing." And because movies are relatively recent invention in terms of human evolution, your brain does have the ability to discern fact from fiction, but at the same time it says, "Well, I just saw this." So it feels more salient. It feels more possible.
Yeah.
And the other component of that is anything that can be vividly imagined or communicated also tends to bias the way that you think that things are going. And yeah, there have been many, many books and studies done about how particularly gifted people can sometimes be the most gullible because we're good at talking ourselves into believing things. I actually wanted to share that was actually the premise of the first AI safety book that I wrote, which is let's just accept for the sake of argument that uncontrollable superintelligence is coming. How do you build a machine that is, even if you lose control of it, it remains safe? I no longer believe that that's even necessarily a meritorious direction to look into. I think it's a
Right.
fun project, but to our point earlier, all of the feedback loops between the research labs building AI and the regulators and the military and the enterprises, I don't think anyone's really going to buy an agent that kind of makes up its own goals. Military doesn't like weapons that go off on their own, and enterprises in particular are extremely risk averse. They don't want
Yeah.
anything that's going to accidentally delete data. They don't want anything that's accidentally going to lock them out or whatever. So the threshold of adoption for all of these stakeholders that control a lot of resources, governments control a lot of resources, enterprises control a lot of resources, and militaries control a lot of resources. So if OpenAI and Microsoft and Google, if they want their AGI to even be adopted to get those resources, it's going to have to be explainable, it's going to have to be safe, and it's going to have to be provable. So yeah, I'm not particularly worried anymore.
Yeah. Good news. Well, we can all look forward to the utopia that awaits us in just a few short years. Then, in that case,
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Jesus. So, look, that's quite a nice segue then into post-labor economics. So, as you know, I'm a big fan of your YouTube channel. Hence why I reached out to you in the first place when I did, however long ago it was, a year ago. Um, so, post-labor economics, you've done a fair amount of content around this. So, do you want to give a brief like intro just to your thinking on post-labor economics, and then maybe I want to ask about whether you've made any revisions to your thinking
Yeah,
recently.
absolutely. So it basically comes down to four criteria, and then I'll define post-labor economics in just a second. But
Uh-huh.
the four criteria are better, faster, cheaper, and safer. Now, we have seen creative destruction and jobs dislocation in the past. Sorry. And so, how many people are farmers today? The vast majority of farming is done by machines. They're driven by humans, but it's done by machines. Telephone operators also went the way of the dinosaurs. It's all handled by machines now. So we have seen plenty of times in the past where entire categories of jobs that were done by humans no longer done. People who take care of horses, right? Before the automobile, if you wanted to get around quickly, you needed a horse. An entire industry completely gone. So we have gone through, in the last 200-ish years, we've gone through three major economic paradigms. So first was the agricultural economy, then the industrial economy, and now a service-based economy. So we have historical precedent to say, okay, we have seen our entire way of life change dramatically within a few decades. Up until the agricultural revolution, most people were agrarian, or nomads or hunter gatherers. Oldest is, of course, hunter gatherers and nomads. Then for about, I don't know, 10,000 years, six to 10,000 years, depending on your geographic location, people were agrarians. Sorry, let me turn off that alarm in the background. People were agrarians, and then the agricultural revolution, followed by the industrial revolution, and then knowledge work and the service industry. So, what post labor economics is, what I've kind of consolidated on, is as machines become better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, it becomes not only economically inevitable that that job gets dislocated or destroyed, it might even become morally or legally compelling to replace humans. So, what I mean by that is, imagine that you have, let's say, a surgeon. You have a surgeon robot that's built in 5 to 10 years. That not only is it 100 times cheaper than a human surgeon, it is also 10 times safer in terms of number of positive outcomes versus number of negative outcomes.
Mm.
If you had a life-saving surgery that you needed, which one would you choose? You're not going to choose a human if the robot is 10 times safer and 100 times cheaper. You're going to go
Yeah.
for the surgery that's going to be an outpatient procedure. It's going to take 30 minutes and you have a 99.99% chance of a positive outcome.
Yeah.
So that's a big if. That
And they're
is
going to
that
work
is kind
around
of
the clock.
right, and it can work around the clock until it needs maintenance or needs to be recharged or whatever. But it's much easier to swap out a robot because they're all mass produced and they're all running the same software. So who cares, right?
Mm.
Pick RoboSurgeon 8 versus RoboSurgeon 9. Who cares, right? They're basically the same.
Yeah.
So they become fungible. So human expertise becomes completely dislocated by these fungible robots. If we accept that this is the direction that things are going, then the vast majority of economic activity done right now will eventually be replaced by a combination of that genius in a jar, that's writing code and doing theoretical chemistry and theoretical physics 24/7, and or robots. And so basically the simplest definition of post-labor economics that I have is basically to say that it is both inevitable and necessary to remove human labor as the primary constraint of economic growth and productivity. So there's a lot to unpack there, but basically one way to look at GDP growth right now is that one of the constraints, it's not the only constraint, but it's a big constraint, is the availability of human labor. So that's unskilled labor, skilled labor, and then of course knowledge work, such as there's only, I think, what, 8 million PhDs on the planet, or around that. So we have a dearth of qualified scientists. We have a dearth of crack mathematicians and crack developers. So what if you remove that as a constraint? If you remove that as an economic constraint, then a whole lot of other things change downstream. That means that no longer are we limited by oh well, there's only so many number of cancer researchers on the planet. Well, what if you functionally have unlimited cancer researchers on the planet? Likewise, what if you have functionally unlimited NASA engineers and nuclear fusion engineers and quantum computing engineers? This is kind of the direction of post-labor economics, which is just saying, maybe humans don't need to be in the loop, or at least don't need to be the bottleneck or the primary constraint on a lot of these activities. With that being said, there's still going to be plenty of other economic constraints, such as the availability of raw materials. Steel is very heavy. Mining it and refining it is a very energy intensive process. In that case, the entropy is the primary constraint, not human labor. But at the same point, in a service-based economy, most of GDP comes from human cognitive effort. That's why it's called a knowledge-based economy or a service-based economy, is because, think of like making a game, right? Making a video game. The raw material input and the energy input is very low. The biggest constraint there is game developers. So that's kind of my 5 minute soapbox spiel about post labor economics.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like the narrative now from lots of, well, smart people on the internet, right, is that the fundamental constraint is going to be energy, right, and the GDP growth, our entire economy is going to eventually be tied very closely to how much energy we can produce, which is why Sam Altman wants to build nuclear reactors and all of this stuff. Are you kind of on board with that?
Yeah, I would say that looking at it from an AI perspective, you say, okay, well, what goes into a data center? There's energy, there's data, and there's chips. So those are the three primary constraints. So I
Mm,
would say it's not just energy. The number of chip fabs in the world able to produce chips fast enough. That's one constraint. The amount of data, which is why talking about O1 preview, where if OpenAI, if they truly did solve the data wall problem, and they have functionally unlimited high quality data, well, that might not be an issue except for how much energy it costs to synthesize the data. And then, of course, the energy itself is a primary thing. And when you look at how much energy like blockchain already consumes, it's something like
mm,
20% of energy generation just on blockchain. And so I've spoken with other people who we kind of anticipate that the vast majority of energy consumed, in 20 or 30 years, it's going to be, like 20% is going to be industrial, 1% is going to be, your power and your air conditioning, and then outside of that 20% of energy, it's going to be 80% AI and blockchain, with most of it going to AI. And this
wow.
is, as we head towards like what Kardashev one scale civilization or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree that energy is a constraint. Now, what I will say though is that necessity is the mother of invention. So whatever the next bottleneck is, and this is a theory of, or law of constraints or theory of constraints, I can't remember what it's called, but whatever you're trying to do, there is always a bottleneck. There is always a limiting factor. So if we end up with energy as a constraint, then we solve that problem. Then what's the next constraint? It might be the number of chip fabs in the world. It might be the amount of data. It might be something else. So it's just a matter of overcoming bottlenecks one at a time.
Yeah.
And that I suspect will have many, many positive downstream effects. So here's what I mean by that is as the demand for energy rises, then it becomes more economically feasible to invest in, say, nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, solar, renewables, so on and so forth, and that will have ideally this of course is speculation, but ideally that'll have the downstream impact of also helping us solve climate change, because if you end up with a hyperabundance of energy, you can clean the atmosphere, you can sequester carbon more cheaply, there's all kinds of other stuff that you can do if you end up with an abundance of energy. So
Mm,
we often see these kinds of technologies recombine in interesting ways and having not necessarily unintended but unforeseen benefits. It's called a spillover. Technological spillover is kind of
right.
one of the principles there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really don't worry about climate change at all now. I just sort of assume that we're trending to solve it. You look at how much solar China's producing, and not only that, but as you kind of allude to, how much energy we're going to need, and the fact that this is now a problem that the world's greatest minds are focused on solving, generating vastly more energy than we'd even be able to do using fossil fuels alone. I just think eventually we're just going to be able to turn down fossil fuels because there's going to be so much more energy coming from elsewhere.
Yeah,
Um, and almost the worst thing we could possibly do is slow down now, like accelerate on through.
right.
Seems the smartest approach, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have made the case that acceleration is, and first let me define acceleration. So for
Yeah.
me, acceleration is defined as maximizing the amount of research done on AI per day, optimize around that KPI. And the reason that I say, and that includes safety research, by the way, that's not just increasing frontier model capabilities. Um, the reason that I say that is the optimal strategy is one, from a geopolitical perspective. You want America and Western allies to um, basically control the economy of the future. Not that it would be, not that it would be world ending if China caught up. The research is all open source anyways. But still, with America and Europe at the lead, I think the world is a kinder place. That's, certainly people will debate that. Um, but anyways, from a geopolitical perspective, from a policy perspective, it makes sense for America and Europe and Britain to optimize for research just for
Mm,
geopolitical reasons. That includes economic reasons, military reasons, and so on and so forth. But then also to that other point about what is the optimal policy to get to the other side of climate change. Because while, yes, I am very sanguine about climate change, if you look at the data, it looks like rate of fossil fuel consumption is actually still accelerating. Some nations are reversing, but globally, in aggregate, fossil fuel consumption is still accelerating. And you look at some charts show that America is now the number one producer of oil. So we're,
mm,
despite the fact that we're moving in the right direction in some respects, you do kind of have to step back and look at the planet as a whole. What is the total amount of fossil fuel usage? What is the total amount of solar? And as others point out, it doesn't matter. Like, let's just say that Germany and France and Britain all become carbon neutral or carbon negative by 2030 or 2035, which seems like it's within the realm of possibility. If the rest of the world hasn't, it kind of doesn't matter. And
mm.
I'll add an
Yeah, doesn't
asterisk to
matter at
that, which
all.
is right, is if you prove that it's possible, that is a step in the right direction. However, market externalities. So, if you're consuming products that are made in a country that also consumes a lot of fossil fuel, that is still part of your carbon footprint. So no, there are still problems to solve, but the problems are all tractable as far as I can tell. It's a matter of industrial scale. It's a matter of political willpower, and the political willpower is there, I believe. Plus, solar is starting to sell itself. The price of
Yeah,
solar has drastically collapsed.
yeah.
Anyways, that's not my area of expertise, but I just wanted to share kind of my thinking on it based on the conversations that I've had and the research that I've looked at.
Yeah, I did an episode on energy and nuclear in particular, and how much that is being constrained by illogical beliefs rather than actual science. The like Germany has just completely decommissioned nuclear almost entirely, and for no good reason, really. Just on a kind of wave of fear on the back of Fukushima, but not really. Like, nuclear is incredibly safe. When you look at it, when you stack it up against almost any other form of generation apart from maybe solar, it's incredibly safe because people worry about it so much. And
Yeah,
nuclear waste is not it's not this green goo that's going to melt everything within the vicinity. It's actually very safe. Most nuclear waste you can stand right next to. If it's
right.
housed correctly, it's not doing anybody any harm. It just has to sit there. So yeah, I know it's a bit of a tangent, um, but I think the logic. If we follow the logic, eventually we'll get to a place where we just really vastly scale up nuclear and essentially solve the problem. I
Yep.
really do, especially with small modular reactors now
Yes.
that seem very viable, and you can build them in all of the decommissioned shipyards. Britain has all of this shipbuilding capability that we've now lost because there's no empire anymore. But you can turn these shipyards into, you can build small modular reactors in them. And anyway, I digress. So on post labor economics, then I've seen you previously doing like a kind of sector by sector breakdown on what's going to go first, what's going to go later, what the big kind of constraints are. Have you made any big reassessments on any of that recently? Because the first content you did on this was a little while back, I think maybe a year, maybe more. Are you reassessing anything with developments in robotics, for example? Is there anything that's really changed your mind on any of your theories on it?
Yeah. So there's, I wouldn't say I haven't done like a full reassessment or recalibration, but certainly my understanding of what to look for has evolved. And so there's a few kinds of things that we should expect to happen, and we're already seeing some of it. So the first jobs that have really gone the way of the dinosaurs, for instance, are call centers. Those There are many companies out there that have laid off the vast majority of their call center because it could just be replaced by an AI chatbot or even an AI voice based chatbot. And so that to me feels kind of like the equivalent of typist pools going the way of the dinosaurs or telephone operators going the way of the dinosaurs. That was kind of like the low hanging fruit. Now, there are many challenges for replacing other kinds of jobs. So number one is just level of integration. um, let's take software developers, and this is why software developers are going to be safe for a little while, is because it's being a software developer is not just about writing code. It is about where to put that code. It is about all of the integrations, all the myriad systems that go into deploying software correctly. It is a very complex task, and so
Mm.
machines are not quite up at the level of being full end to end. Now, with that being said, there's lots and lots of talk about low code, no code, and automation pipelines, so on and so forth. Another concern is statutory protections. So, for instance, to be a doctor or be a lawyer, you have to be a human. You have to have a license in order to be an electrician or a plumber. Again, you need to be licensed. To be a bridge inspector, you have to be licensed. So a lot of these frameworks never anticipated there's no allowances to allow
Mm.
that job to be done by a machine. Um, However, what I suspect will happen is that as economic pressure builds, some cities and states and governments are going to be kind of first movers and say, well, can we allow drones to do bridge inspections instead of humans? Because there's already power companies are already using drones to inspect their own power lines. Why? Because it's faster and cheaper.
Mm.
But there's not a statutory requirement that a power line. I don't think there's a statutory requirement that a power line inspector be a human or be licensed. It's just they're required to inspect their own lines, and so in this respect, we do have plenty of regulatory frameworks and precedent set, which is rather than telling companies exactly how to do it, we just say you need to do this thing. You need to inspect, your bridges. You need to inspect your power lines. It's different when it's a civil service because bridges are owned by the local municipalities or the interstate highway system, and governments are always much slower to adapt to these kinds of things. So regulatory friction, statutory requirements, that's really going to slow down a lot of adoption and a lot of trends. But we
Mm.
already see where, for instance, if there's not union protection, if there's not legal protection, the jobs are really fast to go. Copywriters have been put on notice. Content creators, such as digital artists, a lot of them are getting a lot less work. Freelancers of all stripes are getting a lot less work. So we actually have some data now in terms of what is kind of vulnerable and what is less vulnerable. And to the other part of your question, the biggest unknown I think right now is robotics. To me, it seems like a foregone conclusion that we will have surpassed human level performance on most intellectual tasks within the next 2 to 3 years, if not 2025 at the latest. Entirely, if that's entirely possible. But
Mm.
again, it's going to be limited to whatever it can reach via API, so application programming interface, which is one computer program calls up another computer and says, "Do this for me." Um, Robots, however, are a little bit lagging behind. And what I noticed is that machines seem to be evolving backwards. And what I mean by that is that the very first computers just did math for us, and then they started doing language, right? And now they're starting to engage with the physical world. But that's almost the exact reverse of human evolution,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we had language long before we had math and programming. And so, but then also before humans even existed, as we talked about earlier, we were really good at navigating the physical world. And it seems like robots are going to be kind of the last thing to go because just the nature of the machines that we've built. And I just thought that was a really interesting pattern. I'm not going to say that that is a universal principle to say, it's all going to happen in reverse order, because there's this kind of anticipated phenomenon like an automation cliff, where up until the very last minute, there's more work for humans to do until the very last task that humans can do, which might be planning or guiding or executive function. We're not really sure. then when machines subsume that last task, then there's suddenly nothing for any humans to do. That
Yeah.
is kind of like the economic equivalent of doomerism. I don't think it's going to play out that way. In fact, I think that we're going to replace the service economy with what some people are calling the meaning economy, which is what we're doing here. You and I are participating in the meaning economy by not necessarily adding cognitive value to the world, but we're adding emotional content and philosophical content to our audiences. Now, that's only one component of a potential meaning economy. And again, that is also all hypothetical. So I think that we're going to see a transition from agriculture to industrial to service to meaning is going to be the way that things are going to go. That's kind of my current thinking.
It's not as reassuring, actually. I quite like that, because I am constantly thinking, what are the things that that are still going to be worth doing in, like, 5 or 10 years time. I listened to a Robin Hanson interview, and he was saying that the least automatable job, or the least automatable job is carpet fitting. Apparently, or there's the least, has the least automation involved. It's the most, the most quintessentially human job is laying floors. It's really difficult to get robots to do it. But yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So I mean, it kind of, again, it's quite a nice segue into like the last sort of things I wanted to talk to you about, which is where you find motivation from to continue on this path, given that you, like I, spend a lot of time thinking about meaning, I guess, and about where the future for humanity lies, given the advent of the thing that we kind of feel is special about us being roboticized, automated intelligence. Where do you find the motivation to kind of be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I have a kind of a multispectral understanding of that. So, you know, first principles, we're animals, right? I need to eat, I need to sleep. I'm a social ape, so I enjoy interacting with people, and that sort of thing. A lot of it just comes down to really basic stuff, which is, we get biochemical rewards from good food, spending time with good people, traveling, and all of that still benefits from making money, right? Like money is kind of a universal placeholder for whatever it is that you want to achieve, see, or do. Um, Money is a placeholder for security. It's a placeholder for safety, for travel. It's highly fungible, and that's not to say that money is my primary motivation. I'm just what I'm pointing out is that money still has a lot of utility, and I think that
Mm,
money will continue to have utility for the foreseeable future. The cost of things is likely to change dramatically, just in the same way that in the last 100 years, people spend half as much on food that they used to, and sometimes much less than they used to, depending on what your socioeconomic bracket was. So some things are going to become basically free. Art is basically free now. You can get on Midjourney for $20 a month and have an unlimited supply of custom art that would have cost literally hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to have a human do just a couple years ago.
yeah.
We should expect to continue seeing that. But for me personally, like there's plenty of frameworks out there, and this is actually something that I teach on my community, the New Era Pathfinders, where one of the frameworks that I teach is Roger Walsh's therapeutic lifestyle changes. So the TLCs are 8 basic pillars of, if you do these 8 things, which it includes, diet, exercise, sleep, time with family, giving back or community service, time in nature. There's a couple that I'm missing, but if you do all of those things, you will probably feel happier and healthier. And I've lived by that framework for quite a while. I also teach communication skills because in an era where you may or may not have a career, or a career as we understand it today, where do you get your meaning from? We are humans. We're a social species. Objectively speaking, we get most of our meaning from our relationships. That is our self-esteem, our social standing within our communities. So that includes like social status, but also just the depth and quality and content of the relationships that you have. So, for instance, people that have more quality relationships, they live longer, they're healthier, they're happier. And so, all of this is just a first principles view of what makes humans tick, what makes us work, what keeps us up in the keeps us getting up in the morning. And so that's really, it's just I call it a back to basics kind of course, where there's no magic to it. We're currently living in a culture, particularly here in the West, especially America, where postmodernism and nihilism have taken hold. Which nihilism basically says, well, there is no such thing as meaning, so therefore you're free to make your own. But that completely ignores our biology and our evolution. That just says, well, I wrote the words in a book, and therefore it's true. But it's really going back to clever people being able to convince themselves of completely asinine beliefs. Nihilism is one of those completely asinine beliefs that you have to
Yeah,
completely ignore 1.5 billion years of evolution and the biochemistry of reward signals and everything else. So to me, it's deceptively simple to find meaning in this new world. Like, here's an example. My wife and I, we go to brunch every now and then, and we go to this really nice restaurant. And we have a really good meal, and it's a pleasant atmosphere. It's nothing extravagant, and but it provides a huge amount of meaning for us on those Sundays that we go to Sunday brunch. Um, I spend a lot of time in the woods. I love hiking. I grew up beside a river, and I live beside
mm,
one of the most beautiful rivers I've ever seen in my entire life. I go out there 3 or 4 days a week, and that is, for me, it is spiritual, it is exercise, it is time in nature. And time in nature is good for you biologically. It improves your gut microbiome. It lowers your stress. It
wow.
does all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So like that, like it. There's no mystery to it. It's just we are so out of alignment. Going back to alignment, we as a species, our lifestyle is so far out of alignment for how we are supposed to live. And I say supposed to live based on like how we evolved to live. Cities are a new invention, and they're not necessarily good for us. Just as agriculture is a relatively new invention, and it is also not necessarily good for us. So
Yeah.
some people, I think it was Nate Hagens. I could be remembering incorrectly. It was either Nate or someone else calls it the great simplification. We're all about to have this opportunity to transition back to this really back to basics kind of lifestyle, which is take that first principles view of what really makes you feel good in life. What do you really need to do in order to be happy and healthy and whole? And I'm hoping that the combination of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and nuclear fusion and whatever else comes, we'll all get that opportunity. So yeah, that's kind of my spiel.
Yeah, I mean yeah, it's reassuring. But yeah, and I totally get what you mean about cities. I've really noticed. So as you know, I'm over in the US at the moment from London, and I've noticed that Austin and just the US generally, they're very, very car friendly and very, very pedestrian unfriendly, which is the biggest difference, I think, from European cities, which by and large are very walkable, lots of pedestrianized areas, lots of crossings so that you can get across the road, and lots of like single lane roads. Whereas here, they've all got 6 lanes, and it's really difficult to find anywhere to cross because everybody seems to drive everywhere. And that feels to me like, going back to your point about cities not being especially good for you, it feels like it's encouraging you to never walk, right? It's encouraging you to get straight into a car and then drive. Like literally, there's a cafe that in a straight line is a 2 minute walk, less than. But to get there, you have to cross over like 6 lanes of traffic, and there's no crossing. So it would literally be easier for me to get in the car out here, drive up the road, and all the way back down again, and then pull into the cafe because it's kind of been designed for cars. So um, it's kind of a tangent, but it
Yep.
does it does kind of ring true what you're saying about cities. They're not they're not built for human well-being generally. I don't think they are
Right.
optimized for agglomeration and growth, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, and this is a question that my wife and I talk about all the time, which is what are you optimizing for?
Mm,
There's a few reasons that America is optimized. At least cities are optimized around the car. Part of it was the post-war boom, where we basically had to invent suburbs as they exist today, at least here in America, which was
mm,
saying, hey, we have this huge centralization of knowledge workers, and they need somewhere to live, and they need to be able to get from the suburbs to the office and downtown. And so, yeah, you organize zoning laws, you organize housing codes, you organize all of that around the car, which also became a symbol of American freedom. So now, not only
yeah,
is it a
yeah,
pragmatic optimization, because it was basically around economic optimization, post-war boom. Things were good. America had just come out of the war. We had a bunch of new technology, a bunch of new jobs. So you optimize around the economics of it, but then it becomes embedded in the culture. And now nobody wants to get rid of their cars. In fact, whenever I talk about walkable cities, there's always a few commenters that are just like, that's socialism, that's Marxism, this is idiotic. And I'm like, have you ever been to Europe? Like, walkable cities are great. Like, I remember just going all over Paris, and I was stunned by the fact that you can go across one of the largest cities in the world um, on foot. There are
Mm,
metros, there are light rails, there are buses,
yeah,
and like it's a completely different paradigm of what you're trying to optimize for. And to speak to that, you can put up billboards and all kinds of ugly things in America. It's called visual smog. I just learned. Whereas many European cities are starting to tamp down on visual smog, meaning that you're going to see fewer advertisements in the subways. You're going to see fewer, like, nicer veneers to buildings. And again, it's all a matter of what do you optimize for and why. Is it a cultural
yeah,
paradigm? Is it an economic paradigm? And so on and so forth. And what I hope, this is my aspiration, my wish, is that a lot of American cities and towns, as if the transition happens the way that I hope that it does, we're going to have a very good conversation about where do our priorities really truly lie. What is it that we want to optimize for? Do we want to optimize for the good life? Do we want to optimize for economic productivity or something else? That's where I'm at.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, look, lots of good stuff. So, look, finally, just on you, what have you got coming up? What you're excited about? Anything that people should be looking out for in terms of your ambitions for the next year or more?
Yeah, so I guess I've alluded to a lot of the stuff that I've been working on. So I just mentioned my learning community. It's a growth community called New Era Pathfinders. That is over 300 members and growing. So that's going to be something that I invest a lot of time in the coming year. My wife and I are going to start another one about writing because we're both writers. That's actually how we met. And actually, my debut novel just came out, Heavy Silver. So it came out yesterday as a day of recording. It's
Amazing.
available. Yeah, so it's available paperback only because doing audiobooks are expensive. So I'm hoping to get a deal for that
Okay.
at some point so that we can distribute an audiobook. Let's see, what else am I doing? I mentioned that I'm working with Clemson University on the AI survey. So basically trying to take AI risks and be a little bit more scientific about it. That's about it. I mean, I'm pretty busy. I've also got the open source Raspberry project, which we just had a really good meeting on, trying to get some help with data and compute. Yeah, so those are the high levels of what I'm up to and what I'll be working on for the coming foreseeable future.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure that there's links to everything you've just mentioned in the show notes. Cool. Well, look, David, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really great to chat and hang out, and I'm sure I'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Cheers.